Hello, everyone. Nina and Dilip here. Welcome to a book presentation, Behavioral Science in the Wild. Dilip Soman is a professor at the Rotman School of Management of the University of Toronto and the director of BEHAR, the Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman Research Center. And I'm a professor at the Creston School of Business at the Boston University and co-founder of BE Works. So Dilip, in your own words, what is this book?
Thank you, Nina. I should mention that Nina was also a co-founder of BEHAR when she used to be on the faculty here at the University of Toronto. And I do want to take us back a little bit as we talk about the book. So I guess the applied part of our field really took off in 2008 after Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein published Nudge. And I think it was an interesting book. It demonstrated the power of behavioral science. It demonstrated the ways in which a good understanding of behavioral science could help people make better choices. And that had implications for industry, but it also had implications for business, governments, not-for-profits, absolutely anyone. Fast forward now to 2022, and I think a couple of things have happened. The first thing that's happened is there's a bit of mixed results from using behavioral science. So those of us who are on social media every now and then will see stuff like, I tried XYZ, that's such and such a paper published, but didn't get anything. And so we do have an issue where practitioners are trying to take stuff that's in our published work and apply it to the field, and it doesn't work. And I think the other thing, if you look back at the last 14 years or so, is we haven't done a great job as a field of scaling some of these pilots. We've had lots of amazing success with pilots and proof of concept, and not as much with scaling. So last year, when the two of us sat together and we sort of thought about this issue, I think we were worried about how we can help practitioners better understand translation and scaling issues, and that's why the book. And so obviously the book is a book for practitioners. It does help them understand how to take published research from our behavioral science journals and then apply it and make it work for them. It is an edited book, and it's edited because we definitely, I guess you know this, but so many people that have published in this field were like-minded. They realized that effects don't always work. There are issues in translating and challenging and scaling those. And so I think each of our chapters is written by an expert that goes in, talks about the effect that they are well known for, but also when it works, when it doesn't work, what are the nuances underneath it. And in general, the book is in 4 parts. At the beginning, there's a few chapters that talk about the broader issues, the issues that relate to the field and the bigger challenges of translating and scaling. There's a section that looks at the famous effects in our field, things like the fresh start effect by Katie Milkman and her colleagues, or norm nudging by Christina Pierian and her team. And they've written about, again, when those effects work, when they don't work. There's a third section that looks at domain-specific interventions. So if I'm in healthcare, or if I'm trying to combat misinformation, for example, financial well-being, what do I know in terms of the different options of the breadth of interventions that I could use? And then finally, a bunch of short chapters that essentially have checklists on the how-tos and what to watch out for when you apply behavioral science. So that in a nutshell is the book, but read it, everyone, because it is a treasure trove. But Nina, you and I have spoken a little bit to several other folks and other authors, and one of the things that keeps coming up is the flavor, the feel of the book is different. So do you want to touch on that? Like, why is this book a little bit different from everything else that's out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically what you had already said at the beginning. It is much less about cheerleading, because I think the awareness that our field exists, the awareness that it can be actually quite helpful to have behavioral science as a tool in your toolkit, that awareness and understanding is there. And it's actually quite exciting, right? When we see how many behavioral insights units there have spread up everywhere in all kinds of organizations, whether it's more of a government organization, but also in in for-profit and non-for-profit organizations. So that's a really exciting part that has happened, and that is wonderful. But now, as you mentioned earlier, the problem is that even though our findings are often so intuitive, right, because our research is about humans like you and me, and we can put ourselves into these shoes and we can understand, oh yeah, I've had a situation like this and I'm not always behaving in the best way for me, right? So understanding the intuition is there, but now that practitioners are applying it actually, they're realizing it's actually not that easy, right? So again, as you pointed out, you take something, a finding from a paper that seems very robust, it seems very straightforward, such as, for example, if we tell people that 90% of their peers are working out, so using, for example, social norm nudging in the hope that that will help, and you may find, oh, wait a second, it's not working, what's going on? And what we have heard, you and I, and as well as many of our colleagues, that's then there is this frustration in the field thinking, well, is behavioral science oversold? Does it really change anything? And I think it's important that this book is more of a cautionary tale in that it says, look, behavioral science research is solid, but it has its limitations, and we haven't talked that much about them so far. And here is what the issues are. And one of the big issues are that the way how we write papers, just because how the incentives are for academics, we usually don't explain in detail what's important for practitioners, which is what was the context in which really the experiment was run? At what time of the day? What exactly was the population? How did I get people to sign up for my experiments? Because if I have, if I am, for example, using a panel most likely will be much more focused and paying attention to my interventions. And when I'm scaling something to the wide population, I'm now trying to reach everybody in the regular day-to-day work, right? So those are the kind of details that are often missing. And our book is not only creating awareness that you need to understand the context in which these experiments were run and in which they function, but also trying to understand that if the context matters, let's think about what is the context in which I am trying to translate the research into. And is the likelihood that if I'm translating this to my context, that this will work, is it high or low? And this is where our book can also come in and really inform you, because when we think of a chapter, for example, on financial decision-making or on health and well-being or on diversity and inclusion, we have experts from our field that have written about it, and they can give you in relatively simple language, so not in complicated academic terms, an insight into what have we learned, how robust are certain applications of behavioral science, how robust have certain interventions been across different national cultures. So you name it. That's I think really how the work is different from what has been before. The purpose is different, and the focus is really on the practitioner to help them to translate and scale much more successfully. That's at least what I would say. But I know that you have written a really, really insightful chapter in that book, where actually you explain quite nicely, I think, what one of the, well, I don't know if it's one of the biggest pitfalls, but one of the issues is when practitioners try to translate and scale our insight. And it has something to do with a nudge store. Why don't you explain to us what a nudge store is?
It has something to do with the nudge store. I think while you were talking about some of those sort of domain-specific chapters, I think the other thing that struck me, and we talk about it in the book in a couple of places, is the idea that oftentimes as academics, we make a reputation in promoting a particular intervention and studying something focused. So for example, I might have an intervention on financial literacy that I show improves financial outcomes for people. You might have one on budgeting. But oftentimes a policymaker comes to us and says, I can spend $1 million on budgeting or financial literacy. Which one should I pick? What does the research say? And I often have to look back and say, the research says nothing. because we tend to specialize in our silos. And I think that's the beauty of that section of the book is now we have people who understand the substantive domain, who can talk about the breadth of things. But back to the nut store, I think one of the things that I've found, at least in my interactions with people, is the tendency to lock onto a finding that somebody has demonstrated and say, aha, that's neat. Isn't that interesting that they simplified information, for example, and got more people to do something, contribute to pensions or donate to charity or whatever else. And so we oftentimes try and come up with simple heuristics, things like make it easy or simplify the information or make it timely. And I think back to the points that you were making is that unfortunately, it is true that there are some things in the context, Richard Taylor calls them supposedly relevant factors, that actually change the outcomes, right? And so I guess the push we make in the chapter is to say, we have to resist that temptation into just going into the nut store, see what Nina did and what worked for her, because your context is different. So a couple of quick examples. One is, I've done some work early on showing that, well, we know people overspend when they use credit cards compared to cash. Of course, this was 20 years ago, where credit cards was the easy way of doing it. You can extrapolate that to mobile wallets today. But we also showed that one of the reasons why that happens is that people kind of lose track of the accounting. They lose track of how much they spent. When you tap a credit card, it's not as memorable as, say, writing a check. And so if you give people feedback by a reminder, then in fact that reduces spending. We had some data from South Korea, and we won't get into the details here, but essentially we found the opposite effect in the population, right? When it was scaled up to the nation, on an average, people spent more when they received text alerts as opposed to less. And we were scratching our heads and wondering why this went on. We think it's because of a tendency called digital dependency, right? We've spoken to a lot of people in the field who've said things like, oh, if I ever need to know how much I spend, my phone is tracking it. And so their own motivation to track actually went down as a result, right? So important detail in terms of how the intervention was delivered in the original studies on the same screen in which you tapped your card versus the new study where it went to your phone had a big effect. Now, mind you, there was a subset of the population for which it did work. And that's the other point to highlight. The notion of heterogeneity, right? Is the same intervention can have different effects for different people. One other quick example. This is from work done in Mexico, where we went back to the simple part. Let's simplify information. We simplified the pension statements in an effort to get people to contribute more. We were able to motivate them by putting some information, showing them that with a little bit more contributions, they can be financially secure. Worked really well for about half the population, but not for the other half. And again, we were scratching our heads. In this case, we sort of had an explanation before we went into it, which was that there was a law in Mexico that requires pension funds to state their performance in the immediately preceding period of time. And that information is displayed in rank order. So in any given period, obviously half the funds are going to be in the top half the funds are going to be in the bottom half. And it was fairly evident what was going on. We simplified the information. More people paid attention. They were motivated. But for half of them, they would look at the table and say, gosh, my fund is doing well. Maybe I should contribute more to it. Well, the other half, they would say something along the lines of, my fund isn't doing well. This is important to do. So maybe I should look for other vehicles to invest in, right? And so the idea of simplification worked in that it got more attention, but that may not always be a good thing. And so these are the kinds of things that sort of are subtle changes, subtle things specific to the context that essentially make the principle of simple is better not universal. And I think we need to start paying more attention to that. So that's what we mean by avoiding going to the nudge store. I would always say that published research is fantastic as a source of ideas, as a hypothesis. But we also make the point in that chapter about what we call in situ testing. It's take the idea, make sure it works in your context. And that doesn't mean you have to do a full-blown randomized controlled trial. It can be any simple lab experiment, or even doing a little checklist to compare the situation in your setting as compared to what the paper describes. And that little piece of evidence, that little analysis will give you then either the confidence to say, well, this looks like the same situation and we should proceed, or not, that it needs to be adapted to that particular situation or that particular population. So I think that's really key. And we don't want to be in a situation where we take great work that works in certain conditions, is misapplied to other conditions. And once it's misapplied, we don't want people to lose confidence in the science, because the science is true. It's just that it was applied in the wrong setting. And I think we need to start developing that nuance. So that's that chapter. I know, Nina, there's a part of the book or an aspect that you particularly like, the whole focus on diversity. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I wanted to point out, especially since you just mentioned this whole notion of heterogeneity, right? Much of the research published is usually on the weird population. So it's students, or it's field experiments, maybe, or smaller pilots that will run in, as I said, the so-called weird population. I guess it means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, right? And the world is so much more complex. And so I'm actually very happy that we have a few chapters that focus on that aspect. So, for example, we have a beautiful chapter written by Rafe Mazar. So the last name is very similar to mine. It's not exactly the same. I've actually met him when I was working at the World Bank, and he has spent over 10 years working on issues around consumer protection policies in the context of financial inclusion and digital money. And he has led research in markets including Ghana, Kenya, Malaysia, Mexico, as you just pointed out, Nicaragua, Philippines, Tanzania, and you name it. So you do get his perspective on what are the leading issues when it comes to consumer protection, financial inclusion in that part of the world. Where does he see commonalities? Where does he see differences? So I think that's really wonderful. We also have a chapter contributed by a team from the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics in Nairobi in Kenya, which is all about implementing behavioral science insights in low-income populations in the global south. And also different type of heterogeneity. We do have one or two chapters that are focusing on the digitization of goods, right? So you mentioned earlier the whole notion of misinformation, but we also have a chapter that is actually specifically about how to better use technology to nudge. So I think those are timely and important chapters, and I'm very happy that we have them in our book. So I think we're almost running out of time, so maybe we should actually wrap it up. And Dilip, what do you say? Why should people read our book? What are the main takeaways, insights, whichever way you want to take?
The elevator pitch. I always wonder where these elevators are, where people make pitches. But gosh, so let's start. I guess what we're trying to say really is to practitioners, don't just rely on the shiny, beautiful findings that you read about in the newspaper and believe them. I mean, they're true, but they might be true unique to that particular context. Now, as a practitioner, you don't have the time to do all the due diligence, and you don't have the time to figure out what has worked, what else has worked, when has this not worked. And I'd say, therefore, the value of this book is in one collection, in one volume, it brings together the breadth of what works, what doesn't work, and why it works. And therefore, as a practitioner, what should you watch out for when you're looking to develop interventions to solve a particular behavior change problem in the field? So I'd say that's the value of the book. And if we can steer not just friends in practice, but also our colleagues in academia to just be a little bit more nuanced in the way we apply findings that have been published, and to rigorously develop the habit of testing, no matter how simply, no matter how quickly, but just quickly testing everything before it gets scaled up and rolled out in the field, I think the book would have been a success. So please, everyone, read the book. We suspect you'll enjoy it. And as Nina says, it's not as much of a cheerleading book. So we don't talk about how great this is by by obfuscating some of the challenges. So I think if you're looking for a nuanced view of how to apply behavioral science within organizations to solve complex problems, behavioral science in the wild. 24 chapters, University of Toronto Press. And again, fantastic work, Nina. It was a privilege doing this with you. And hopefully everyone loves it as much as we love doing it.
Thank you all.